Okay, perfecto. The 700 light switches, right? All right, perfect. All right. Testing. All right. Okay, we're good to go. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Or for the first time, I don't know. I haven't been keeping an eye on the class list over the last day, so I'm not 100% sure if people have been moving in and out of the class. Okay, so obviously sociology of youth, and today we are going to start off, looking at a couple of important questions. Specifically, we're going to start our look at the history of childhood and youth, and kind of start trying to build an idea of where these concepts kind of came from historically, building towards, of course, just an understanding of where we are today and what our generational cohorts look like. Before I do that, though, obviously, if you weren't here last time, you can absolutely ask questions by raising your hand. Happy to answer them in that way. I also use this, which is called Slido. It's like a live Q&A thing. Go to that website, put in that code, and you can enter questions. Before I jump into kind of the topic for today, I know people may be moving in and out of the class. Does anybody have any questions about the course before I start? Yeah, please.
If I remember correctly, you mentioned that you recorded the lecture.
Yes.
How can we access it?
I will put a link to a YouTube playlist on the e-class. I just haven't had it yesterday. It was a bit of a nutso day. I haven't had a chance to do so. I'll try to do it, I'm going to say tomorrow. Because I'm like, when do I have time? Tomorrow. Yeah, and it'll all be there, and basically as I go through and update or record them and then put them on the playlist, it should show up. I'll try to, usually I have time on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I will try to make sure I'm linking everything back on those days. But yeah, it'll be there if you happen to miss something. Are you planning to skip class on Friday because it's minus 35 or something? I wish I could. The miss that about being a student is I don't want to go today, so I'm just not going to do that because it's really cold. When you're in charge of the class, it doesn't work out quite as well. Other questions before I jump into content? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? Okay, so we're going to kind of start our discussion here of the history of kind of youth and childhood with this book. So it's called The Disappearance of Childhood. And it's now, a little bit dated because it, was written first and first published in 1979. So it's not, the most current book, but I think it does a good job in kind of giving us a quick hit kind of history of what where our concept of childhood and youth kind of comes from, right? Now the second half of the first half of the book, right, the first 4 chapters is really about tracing, the appearance of our sense of, childhood and youth in the West. And then the second half of the book, which we'll talk about briefly at the end of the class, is about Postman's fear that this concept will be undermined by technology. And this is actually I think, one of the kind of recurring themes of the course. When we get later in this chapter, I'm going to talk about an idea from Jean Twenge, who's a psychologist and professor at San Diego State University, who's done a lot of work on generations, which she calls the technology kind of model of generations, right? Basically sort of thinking about how technology ultimately changes our conception of how we think about generations, how we think about young people in major ways, and who gets classified as a young person broadly. Okay, so, all right. Who's Neil Postman? So he basically kind of an interesting character, part of a sort of tradition of mostly media studies that started out in Toronto and then spilled over in New York City. So he spent most of his career, I mean, he's a teacher by trade, right? He went to Columbia for a teaching degree and then got, PhDs in education, but ended up being kind of a media scholar at NYU for a long time. And he wrote, what I think, in the field of, say, science, technology, and society, or media and society studies, some books that became sort of foundational, if, at times people don't love them. So this book, is probably kind of the beginning of his work on technology and its effects on society, which was followed up then by a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, which basically said that at some point, because we're such a media-saturated culture, politics would and all public discourse would devolve into a form of entertainment. I still maintain that he essentially predicted the rise of Donald Trump. When the reality TV star becomes an actual kind of the president of the United States, we've crossed into, amusing ourselves to death. Mostly Amusing Ourselves to Death is about television. It was written in 1986. So, again, it's still old, but it's still, I think, well regarded. And then kind of, his two kind of last books, Technopoly and Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, are both about the effects of technology on society. And basically, his worry that we're giving up all of our autonomy to technology and we're just letting it make all of our decisions for us. Okay. So this book specifically, though, is about kind of trying to trace out where our idea of childhood and youth kind of comes from. Now, Postman, I think, a little bit unhelpfully, and maybe this is a function of the fact that he's writing in, at the end of the 1970s, when he talks about childhood, he's talking about this very broad period that he says is between the age of 7 and the age of 17, right? So encompassing essentially everything that comes once you start primary school all the way through, essentially the end of secondary school. Now, there's problems with this sort of definition, right? It's a very, I think, kind of mid to late 20th century kind of definition. And what's happened since then is we've actually had, I think, this idea of youth expand pretty massively, right? We've had this idea of what we now call in sociology emerging adulthood kind of tacked onto this category, right? So that emerging adulthood basically now refers to, young people who are between the ages of, say, 18 and 29, right? So people who are, essentially, emerging adulthood, you might kind of get the sense from the term. Adults, but not quite adults. And this is a very kind of 21st century, 2010s and 2020s kind of concept, because there came to be this recognition in sociology that, millennials and then Gen Z weren't sort of, at 18, weren't adults in the same way as maybe the baby boomers and the silent generation and even Gen X had been. That there was something fundamentally a little bit more delayed in their process through adulthood. Now, when we get to the end of this unit, and I need to update it a little bit. I was working on the slides yesterday, so I will upload an updated one. We'll talk about what those generations look like. So we'll talk about the silents, we'll talk about the boomers, we'll talk about Gen X, and then millennials and Gen Z, because there's some really interesting kind of differences in a lot of their life patterns. But just to kind of let's give you a little bit of a spoiler, why this is important and how much your generation is different from, say, 3 generations ago, the silent generation. The average, so I was just reading this yesterday and it, made me make a little bit of a double take. Half of women who were married in the 1950s, right, so this is the silent generation who were getting married, were teenagers, right? They were 18 and 19. Compare that to today, where the average age of first marriage for a woman is about 28, right? There's been a 10-year shift. So like the process into adulthood today is a lot slower than, say, what I think Postman was thinking of, where it's like you graduate from high school, you go off, you get a job, you maybe think about getting married in a couple of years. Your generation's a lot different, and so we now have this very much expanded definition of youth, which will go up to like 29, right? I hope I live long enough so that I can once again be included in the definition of youth as I age, right? It's maybe in my 40s we'll start to be called youths again, but probably not. I've aged out of it by a long shot. But right, it's now we're talking about emerging adulthood, because through your 20s, and I'm sorry to say this, you're not doing the things that other generations did, which made them sort of fully adult, right? Getting married, getting a mortgage, having children. That's something that's now put off a lot later. Okay, but that being said, right, he's defining childhood. I think it kind of includes like childhood as we would think of it, and teenage years or youth in a pretty broad way. And yeah, I think it'll line up in some ways, though it ends earlier than our definition that we'll use for the course, which is going to include everybody really up until the age of 29. One of the things that Postman is really trying to do in the book, though, and I think this is where his focus on technology and the way that it affects our worldview and who we think of as children, is to sort of try to break down this idea that childhood and youth are ultimately a sort of biological or natural category. Because what he's going to argue in the book is that our definition of childhood emerged because of particular historical circumstances in the West, right? Things that happened in the West, and then it actually took about 400 years from the key kind of event that he thinks triggered the move towards creating a definition of childhood and a kind of modern notion of childhood as we would recognize it. Okay. So, one of the things that Postman does, is he wants to establish the fact that our version of childhood, the way that we think of childhood, particularly as this time of, innocence, right? As a time where everybody, right? Everybody who's between a certain kind of age range is innocent, and they are exempt in a lot of ways from the demands of society, right? Where childhood is this period where you are nurtured into what will eventually be an adult, where you can start taking on social roles, like working, like contributing to your family economically, and all of these sorts of, not really, right? You wouldn't had, okay, there was technically no word in Greek that meant what we mean as a child, right? They didn't have that kind of proper sense of this kind of birthday to birthday kind of period where you would have been, raised and nurtured and wouldn't have had any adult responsibilities. Amongst, certain people, the Greeks had a broad concept of youth. Now, this would have applied only to, when we're talking about the Greek city-states, places like Athens, citizens, right? So people who are Athenian citizens who were part of the kind of elite, they might have had, this kind of period where their young people would have had a period called youth. Now, it's very, very amorphous, right? Wherein, you could be a youth from, say, 10 years old till 35, it depended more on the social role you were taking more than your actual age, right? It was the period, right, where you should be educated, but some citizens would have been educated for a few years, and some would have been educated for a decade, but it wasn't consistent, right? So it was more an idea of, you were a youth because you were, sitting at the feet of a philosopher and learning from him, more so than an age-limited category. Now, this, of course, did not, really include certainly the large underclass of slaves, which made up the economic base of Greek society, right? If you were a slave or a non-citizen, and you were 7 years old, you were put to work, right? You were part of the economy, right? You were part of, you were mucking out a stable, or you were serving in a kitchen or something, right? So it wasn't a universal sense that everybody's children had a childhood or even a youth, right? It was very much, for those who got to be educated, it was the wealthy, the elites, and all of those things. Okay. Make sense? All right. So, in kind of Western antiquity, and we have to sort of put the rest of the world to one side. We're talking here about the West. In the ancient world, right, in kind of the Mediterranean and European world, Postman suggests ancient Rome, right, the Roman Empire, probably had the most defined view of childhood. And one of the things that he sort of suggests is that because the Roman Empire was so big, right, and the Roman Empire was massive, it required, amongst other things, a large class of literate, by ancient standards anyway, of literate people who could administer the empire, right? So a lot of the messages, right, in terms of, what are we doing militarily? Do we retreat? Do we fight back against the Germanic tribes on the northern border? Would have all been communicated by writing from the kind of central location, at first Rome and then Constantinople. But wherever the empire was headquartered, wherever the emperor was, they were the ones handing out orders, and this was mostly done in writing. So this required a lot of people who were able to read and write, which meant a lot of education, right? You had to have a lot of people being educated to serve as this kind of scribal class. And what Postman thinks is that ultimately it was this kind of dedication to the written word, and maybe, somewhere between 15 to maybe 20% of the kind of citizen population amongst Romans would have been literate, right? Pretty high levels by the standards of the ancient world. Now, what Postman kind of suggests is that this education and the fact that you get this, basically people are taught to read, and he'll get to this when he talks about the invention of the printing press, moving from simple writing to more complex writing ultimately sort of creates a sense that some information is for children, some information isn't, right? So you start teaching young people to read with very simple text, and then you move them into more complex text. And he suggests that what you get out of that is a sense that some things are for kids, some things are not. And it creates a sense of shame, right? So, shame, he means, right, that you shouldn't divulge too much information about the world in ways that are inappropriate for children. And we know this, the Romans left a lot of stuff behind. So we know a lot of the things that were part of kind of Roman social life, right? Because we have people like Cicero, who would write these big treatises on what was okay to do in polite Roman society. And amongst the things that were not okay to talk about, right, in a lot of times a public setting, but certainly not okay to talk to children, were things like sex, politics, economics, and war, right? So, a lot of the same things you think of as like, you shouldn't talk about in polite company, right? You shouldn't talk about politics and religion. The Romans had their own list, and it included, politics, economics, sex, and war. So they had a sense that these things weren't for children. And Postman thinks, right, that this was a kind of early flowering of the idea of childhood, right? And again, not evenly distributed, because, amongst the Romans, there were, again, these massive underclasses of people. The Roman economy was very much run by slaves, right? The Romans would go off and capture whole nations and bring them back, and they would become their slaves. And those people, right, there was no teaching them to read and write. There was no, shielding them from any of these things. It was all the time. Yeah, please.
For that sense of shame, do we need to know the name of the educator that?
Cicero? No.
In the book it said, it starts with a Q.
Quintinius, I think, no, don't worry about it. Yeah, I can't remember either. Roman names are funny. They all start with C's and Q's. But yeah, don't worry about the specific name. I won't test you on that. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of, we have a ton of it. The Romans were prolific in terms of writing, essentially like Miss Manners manuals, right? Like what is okay to write about, what's polite, and all of that stuff. Okay. Yes, please.
Do we know
like the time of like, or what the Romans considered no longer to be child, like a child, or because I imagine it'd be like a much younger.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of towards like early adolescence, right? Be like 13, 14. Definitely not kind of 18 because they lived in a very different world, right? They didn't have the sort of leisure to shield their children for as long. But regardless, and again, it depends on kind of place, time, and location, right? And who you are, right? If you are a slave or if you are a free man, but not a citizen, it's going to be a little bit different. And certain things like, you're going to start working, if you're, a slave, you're going to be working from the time that you're basically able to do something useful, right? Probably somewhere, between 7 and 8, right? Whether it's, helping in the kitchen or whatever, right? There's also a lot of weird things with the Romans. They did, especially with adolescent boys, and girls actually, they didn't have necessarily big qualms about, say, having sex with them. The Romans were pretty okay with that. So it's not exactly our idea, right? And especially like, if you had a slave who was 14 or 15, you could essentially do what you wanted with them, whether that was, sadly, whether that was beat them nearly to death or straight to death, actually, or have sex with them in any way that you wanted if you were a citizen and you owned them, right? So again, there's a kind of echo of what we have today, though it's not an exact parallel, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? They're great questions. I love questions. Okay. So what ultimately happens, right? Obviously, we know nothing lasts forever, and the Roman Empire was no different, right? Without giving you a treatise on Roman history, though you absolutely all should know, and apparently, according to what a TikTok, men think about the Roman Empire quite a bit. But everybody should, I think, probably study Roman history because this particular event ends up being one that's so, I think, traumatic that it's still burned into the consciousness of people in the West. I can't even count the number of times in my life that something happens and someone compares the decline of America to the decline of the Roman Empire. It's super fun to think about, but also kind of weird that we're still hung up on something that happened in 476. Okay, so what happens in 476 in the West, right, is after probably like a 2 centuries long decline, right, the western part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had been split into 2 parts. The Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and the western part of the Roman Empire centered first in Rome and then in Ravenna, both in Italy. But what happens is you get these Germanic tribes that start, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. If you want to see how burnt into our consciousness Roman history is, Goth, for someone who's kind of dark and brooding, literally comes from these Germanic tribes that invaded the Roman Empire, and the Vandals who sacked Rome and ripped off all the gold and carted it away. Why do we call people who wreck things Vandals? Is because of these guys, because it wrecked the Roman Empire, and specifically they went into Rome, which had been sort of a unconquered city for a millennium, and sort of trashed it and stole all the good stuff. So it's really seared into Western consciousness. All right. Anyway, sorry. Sidebar. But yeah, so following a bunch of these invasions, the western part of the Roman Empire basically collapses. There's some guy in Rome being like, I am Emperor Romulus the Seventh, and then some Teutonic warlord comes in and says, you're absolutely nothing, shut the hell up. And that's the end, the end of the Roman Empire. And what happens at the end of the Roman Empire is basically the whole Roman system that had kind of connected Europe essentially falls apart, right? So there's what had been a kind of unified empire breaks up into a bunch of feudal kind of kingdoms for about 1,000 years, right? So you get, from about 476 until around the 1400s, you're in what's called the Middle Ages, right? Now, this used to be referred to as the Dark Ages, and if you read Postman's book, he still calls this the Dark Ages. I will say no historian worth their salt today calls the Middle Ages the Dark Ages anymore, because actually, well, the Dark Ages was this kind of phrase that comes out of the Enlightenment, where they said, oh, what happens after the collapse of the Roman Empire is the Catholic Church takes over and religion smothers the light of learning from Europe for 1,000 years. That isn't what happened. Right? Yes, the Catholic Church becomes the most powerful institution in medieval society, but a lot of learning actually continues to happen. And Europe goes into the Middle Ages, say technologically behind places like India and China, it comes out of the Middle Ages far ahead technologically. And I mean, even, after it emerges, the kind of Islamic empires, first, the kind of Arabian and then Ottoman empires are way ahead of Europe technologically. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe is well ahead in all sorts of ways in terms of technology. So the Enlightenment says, oh, that was a dark age. It really wasn't. But what does happen is that whole political system that the Romans had built falls apart, and you get kind of feuding kingdoms. But what really is important here is that you get a fundamental reorganization of society away from the imperial Roman system to feudalism. And one of the things that Postman is correct about is that reading becomes far less important because there isn't any longer this massive bureaucracy that needs to maintain this far-flung empire, right? The ability to read becomes much more condensed into a much smaller scribal and priestly class, mostly controlled and educated by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, literacy plunges, but it plunges for a really good reason. Nobody really needed to read during this period, right? The social environment wasn't one that really required anybody or a large number of people to be literate, so most people weren't. Okay. So, according to Postman, and I think he's right here, without reading, culture became primarily oral, right? So it became mostly about verbal communication in some way. And most people really never needed anything more than kind of basic skills to speak and communicate with others, right? Again, there is this kind of class of, priests, monks, and, basically courtesans that serve kings and nobles that are able to read and write, but most people just really have no use for it, right? Their lives are very much agricultural, built in communities, built around particular skills that are taught to them by masters, and so don't really require reading and writing skills. A lot of things in medieval society are just not that complex, right? You live probably in a village, and if you manage to get a few, 10, 20 kilometers away from your home, you've done more than the average medieval person, right? Because most people lived and died, in a very small kind of location. So reading wasn't as essential as it was during the Roman period. Most people, it's a time that's relatively poor. Most people in the Middle Ages tended to live broadly in pretty close quarters, right? Most of them out of the cities, right? The big Roman cities kind of collapsed at the end of the Roman Empire, and most people moved into rural communities. Most people, in feudal society would have been serfs who lived on plots of land that their family had occupied for decades or even centuries that were owned by a feudal lord, and they probably lived in a 1 or 2 room house, right? So they lived in pretty close quarters. So one of the things that happens, there's no sense of private space in the Middle Ages, right? And what this means is, children are not shielded from the adult world at all, right? And Postman has some, anecdotes, of, what communal meals looked like, and the fact that, in the Middle Ages, as a joke, people would have, grabbed the genitals of children. But I mean, just kind of on a basic level, if there's no private or personal space and no sense of the private, right, all sorts of things become pretty apparent, right? If you live in a 1-bedroom house or 1-room house, with your family and your parents have, 6 or 7 children, you end up with a pretty good sense of how those children were ultimately created. Because there's not a whole lot of sense of privacy going on, right? Education, right, in a hierarchical sense, where you kind of start with the basics and learn, disappears in all but a few cases, right? In terms of people who are selected, again, mostly by the scribal or priestly class to kind of be, the learned men of that society, but it's mostly just not that useful. Okay. So, what brings all of this to an end? Fundamentally, what brings the Middle Ages to an end is the printing press, right? The printing press is a phenomenal invention in the history of kind of Western society. It essentially transforms medieval society into something altogether different. Now, a lot of these changes had, like I said, sort of been bubbling for a while, right? There'd been a lot of technological progress in the West, but the invention of the printing press essentially makes information much more available to a lot more people, right? Because it suddenly, I'll put it this way. I'll tell the story of Johannes Gutenberg because it's a fun story. Because we hail Gutenberg for his invention, but sadly, the man never really got to profit from his own invention, an invention that transformed, society fundamentally. So Gutenberg, in what we would think of as Germany today, basically was a kind of, tinkerer and innovator. He was a goldsmith by trade, and he comes up with this idea, right? That basically, one of the things that Gutenberg knows is that people really love the Bible, right? And Bibles are super hard to get, right? Why? Because every text in the Middle Ages, if you're going to get a copy of it, has to be copied by hand. And if you've ever looked at the Bible, you can imagine how long it would take you to copy that by hand. And it's not just that they were like physically writing the letters. In the Middle Ages, they'd also come up with this thing where they had illuminated manuscripts. So you had to make everything pretty, right? So you're not just copying the letters, as you might in a notebook, you're making like images, and some of the letters are cursive and all swirly and all of this stuff. If you ever just Google illuminated manuscripts, they're really cool looking, but you can imagine how long it would take to physically copy one of these, right? So there's Irish monks somewhere in some monastery, copying everything by hand for centuries, which makes things really, really, really expensive, right? Because if you're going to buy something that took someone maybe 3 years of their life to produce or more, right? Depending on how good they are at copying. So Gutenberg comes up with this cool idea. He's like, what if I could make a whole bunch of Bibles? And he knows that there's a religious fair going on in a neighboring town in Germany, the next year. He's like, how could I make a bunch of Bibles? And he's a goldsmith, and he comes up with this idea basically of creating movable type, right? Basically making the letters shapes, dipping them in ink, and using an old wine press that he's purchased on credit. He borrowed money to do all of this in order to produce, the pages of the Bible over and over again, so he can make a bunch of copies and then sell them and make a ton, right? Because this way he thinks he can make copies of the Bible much more quickly. And he succeeds, right? He actually does copy the entire Bible, makes multiple copies of it, and heads off to this town for what he thinks is this religious fair, only to discover that he got the year wrong, and it actually had happened the year prior. So he goes back home, and his creditors, who had lent him the money to make this printing press, and they're like, you promised us we were going to get our money back. And he's like, so the thing is, no, they seize the Bibles, and they seize the printing press, right, as creditors are wont to do. Don't pay your car payment, they're going to take your car. If you invent a printing press and you don't pay your creditors, they get the printing press. And so Gutenberg dies in obscurity, but his creditors very quickly realize the genius of what he's created, right? And they themselves go on to profit massively from both the original copies of the Bible that he's created and the invention itself. So suddenly we have a technology to print things. Now, even then, if you want to print things, you need something to print. And there's only going to be so much demand for the Bible at the end of the day. But it just so happens that around the same time, there's been a sort of renewed interest in the classics, right? Europe is, for a lot of reasons, has been really interested really from sort of the 14th century, the 1300s, in people like Aristotle and Plato, right? And if you look at, say, a 14th century kind of scholar like St. Thomas Aquinas or Maimonides, right? They were really interested in classical works of Aristotle. And so they had become very prominent, and there's a big demand for the original texts of all of these Greek thinkers. And they suddenly start to become available from a few sources. For one, you do have Arabic copies of these works that start to trickle into the West from the Ottoman Empire, right? The kind of Ottoman and kind of Muslim rulers of the Middle East had kept a lot of these texts alive and were very much engaged with them. The other thing that happens is that, in the 1450s, the Ottomans, so the Turks, sack the city of Constantinople, right? Which is, like I said, is modern day Istanbul. Is the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or what you would call the Byzantine Empire, probably if you're looking at history. And, with the Muslim conquest of kind of this big Greek-speaking city, a lot of the monks and scholars grab their copies of Aristotle and Plato and all the others that they've been holding on to for centuries and basically hoof it for Christian lands, right? So they're heading across into Germany and Italy where they think they'll be safe from the Ottoman Turks. So they bring a bunch of these things as well. There's also the discovery that the Irish have been copying these things painstakingly by hand in Catholic monasteries in Ireland. So you have interest, and now you have a product, and people start to copy the books. The other thing that kind of works in their favor is two things that ended up getting transferred along the Silk Road from China, right? Paper and ink that you could use for this kind of publishing. Basically, paper making technology, right? How you would make paper first out of parchment, right? So essentially cloth that you break down and turn into a kind of paper, and then pulp paper kind of comes to the West via the Silk Road from China. People figure out how they did it, and now you have three things. You have a device that can print, you have things that people want to read, and you have the ability to make something cheap that they can read it on. Because prior to that, people were reading on, that's not papyrus. Papyrus was the Romans. It was basically made out of animal hides, and it was super expensive. And I can't remember the word for it right at this moment, but it will come to me. And so, these older copies of the Bible are written on like goat skin or something like that. Very, very tough and very difficult to produce at scale. Paper is very easy to produce at scale. So the technology gets adopted very, very quickly. And I mean, basically, within about 80 years, you have printing presses in all of the major European countries, right? I know that seems slow because you're like, well, the iPhone was released in 2007, and by say like 2015 everybody had one, but by the standards of the time that's really, really quick. Okay, how much time do I have left? 8 minutes. Okay, I can do this. Well, I mean, I can't get through this whole section, but we got lots of time. For Postman, what happens with printing is it changes the fundamental kind of economic balance of the whole society, right? If you've ever heard this kind of aphorism from Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, right? Postman is a real believer in that this idea that the communication technology of a particular time ultimately reshapes the way people think about things and can actually reshape societies as a whole. And, as much as I first read this, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man from Marshall McLuhan when I was an undergrad. And no matter how hard I try to get away from this idea, I always end up coming back to it because, just in this recent book that I've been reading, Generations by Jean Twenge, she's got her technology model of generations. And I'm like, fuck, this is the medium is the message again. Do I ever get to leave you, Marshall? No, I don't. Okay. And more than that, Harold Innis, who was his kind of teacher as well, had a similar idea in a book called Empire and Communication. But anyway, right, what Postman thinks is that printing starts to create a separation between children and adults, right? Whereas in the Middle Ages, right, by age 7, right, you had the speaking skills you needed to become an apprentice, right, to go to work, to understand the basics of medieval society, and to participate in economic life. Print allows people to communicate information much more efficiently. It allows for a ton of information, right? It allows for knowledge to move between places much more quickly. And what Postman says is adult knowledge, even in the kind of basics of life, starts to outpace just the common knowledge you would have just by living in major ways. And he thinks reading becomes the basis for adulthood in lots of ways. Right, because as the economy gets more complex, as more complex industries appear, and then once you get to the period of industrialization, right, reading becomes 100% necessary to enter adult life. Okay, right, so children can speak and understand speech, right? That's not a problem. So in the Middle Ages, they were able to participate in the economy very quickly. But children need to be taught to read, right? And it's a pretty painstaking process. It takes a long time and it doesn't come quickly, right? Even if they understand the basics of reading, the need to kind of increase the complexity of their reading, their vocabulary, and the thinking that goes along with it takes a really long time, right? And so what Postman thinks is print and this need to cultivate people for a long time into the medium that makes them an adult means they have to be given this period of innocence and removal from social obligation in lots of ways in order to develop those skills. So for Postman, print makes childhood not just, possible, it does, but also necessary, right? You can't have childhood without kind of print, because print is what ultimately, the written word and needing to learn the written word to be part of adult society is what makes that period of cultivation necessary at the end of the day. You don't need a lot of cultivation if all you're going to be doing is, milking cows and plowing fields. But when it gets to more complex things in societies like banking, like lending, like being a scribe, like working in heavy industries, it becomes more necessary to have that period of cultivation. Okay. Oh, Nunny McShame. I like you. Okay, Postman's 3 conditions for childhood then ultimately are these 3 things. Shame. My dad's 77 now. So he grew up in a very different world, something that I'm always reminded of talking to him. He went to Catholic boarding schools. Essentially, the Catholic boarding schools, because his parents were lumberjacks. They ran a lumber mill. And I remember him always telling that there was one nun at this Catholic boarding school that they called Sister Paul the Murderer. And I always think of Sister Paul the Murderer when I see this lady. I don't know why. Okay, so shame, right? So what is shame? Basically, some idea that certain things are not for children. Postman thinks is the basis for an idea of childhood. Literacy, right, which is essentially the mode in which shame is maintained. I'll get to you in 1 second. And then schools, which is where literacy is taught. Yeah, please.
So shame that you should know that you are a child.
There are certain things that you shouldn't tell a child because they're right, because children shouldn't know about sex, right? That it should be something because they're innocent, right? That innocence should be maintained. They shouldn't find out about sexual things until they're properly sort of prepared for it and mature enough and have the cognitive level to understand it. Politics, right? They shouldn't have to worry about the wars happening in the world because they're just children, right? And they should have that innocence maintained. Economics, right? It's funny, how much time do I have? Enough time for this anecdote. One of the weird disagreements I have with my wife is she has this very kind of old school thing of like, our kids shouldn't know how much money we have or make. She's like, well, they don't need to worry about money. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. We should teach them kind of economics, like how to manage money. And it helps to know, how much money comes off of your paycheck. Oh my God, it's so much, when you get paid. So it's like, oh yes, I make this amount of money, but this is how much the government takes in taxes, because she was taught in this very kind of traditional way that money is shameful, right? That you shouldn't discuss money with children. And it's a sort of hangover of this idea that there are some things that aren't appropriate for children to know. Okay, well, as people are walking out on me and I got 1 minute left, that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up with this slide on Friday, and we'll keep going. Okay.
I don't know where it is.
Well, follow me.
Yeah.
I know where it is.
Yeah, I literally was like, I walked into my resource sociology class today, and it's PhD students. Like they're up to graduate, so they haven't. Yeah.
Okay.
What I'm talking about. So, anyways, it's
Yeah,
PhD
they're like a
students.
candidate.
Yeah, that's a word. Yeah. And they were like, I was reading like their syllabus, and they just seemed like not very nice. They were like, if you have COVID, that's not a valid excuse. I will not be catching you up. Like, you need to make friends in the class. Yeah, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to graduate. I was like, I know he's not a nice professor, so I'm just going to figure it out.
I don't know, honestly, I do not know why people do stuff like that. It just...
Oh, and it said that there's like,
Okay. Okay, just give me a second here. Double checking stuff. Looks like my stream is live and there's a few people watching. I'm just double checking. Okay. Alrighty, I think everything looks good. I'm looking at it in YouTube Studio. So if you are taking a look, hang on, I am just adding a camera here. Okay. Oh, actually right here. Myself. Here I am in my office. I'm gonna move myself up to the top corner here. Okay. If someone could just say hi on the Slido or in the chat just to make sure that everybody can hear me. I would greatly appreciate that. Take this off. Ah, perfect. Thank you. Much appreciated. All right, I am gonna minimize this. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your flexibility this morning. I was actually near campus this morning, driving my daughter to school. But when I got up this morning and I saw the wind chill factor at like minus 40 something, I was like, yeah, this is going to be nasty. So I'm like, let's just have people stay home and not risk, not risk them getting frostbite if we can avoid it. So all my 3 classes I've moved online. Did my kids have to go to school today? Yeah, my kids had to go to school today. I drove them both because the bus didn't come for one, and for my daughter, she's 14 and it's her birthday today. So her special request was to get a ride to school. Okay. So I'm glad this is working. Hopefully people got the message. I'm really hoping, but we'll do our best here. Okay. So, maybe I should check my phone to make sure I don't have any emails. Like, where is class today? Oh. That is, all right. Okay, perfect. Yes, looks like people got the message. All right, so I'm going to jump in here. We are going to talk about, what we were talking about last time. So, where were we last time, right? We were talking about, and maybe here we'll go back to where we were talking about the printing press, right? So we're talking about Neil Postman's book, The Disappearance of Childhood, and his kind of notion of where our ideas of youth and childhood ultimately come from, right? And he thinks that ultimately, right, if we go back to the Greeks and Romans, they didn't really have an idea of childhood the way we do. The Romans were probably the closest, but we really don't get the beginnings of our sense of childhood until, the 15th century with the invention of the printing press. Now, it doesn't happen all at once, right? This is just the beginning. It's going to take about 400 years. And really, for Postman, what's important is that the printing press creates a new information environment, right? And it creates one where you need to be able to read to fully engage in the adult world, right? Because, suddenly the basis of adulthood becomes not just, not just speaking, but actually reading and writing as well, right? And as the economy gets more and more complex and tasks become more and more complex, we move into that more and more. So, yeah, the printing press is the basis for this. Okay. Yeah, EPS should have moved class online today. So dangerous for young people to be outside. Yeah, just dangerous for anyone to be outside. Yeah, everybody should, I think, have to be at home. We could do it for one day. Alrighty, let's clear that. Okay, so we ended off on this slide. And I'll just say, right, if you're wanting to ask questions, you can use the Slido. I've got the chat on YouTube open as well, so feel free to, throw a comment in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on both. Okay, so Postman's 3 conditions for childhood, right? What does he think they were? Shame, right? And we talked about this in the context of, the Roman Empire, right? This idea that there are things that young people should not know,
right? That there are things that adults should not be mentioning in front of children. He thinks that's part of the basis for childhood, right? That you need shame in order to have childhood in a realistic sense. So, shame being one, right? There's information for adults, there's information for children, and adults manage that. You manage what information children get. Literacy, right? So, literacy as well. You need to be able to read because that's the method with which you control what children know about, right? Because you kind of can meter out the information slowly. And school, of course, is where literacy is ultimately taught. Alrighty. So that's where we ended off last time. Okay. So, so the shift in Europe, from oral to the emerging print culture, postman things, is what it causes new social categories to basically come into existence, right? That new social categories happen when you have a big technological shift in this way. So, when we're talking about this particular period of history, right, he thinks that children, the people who can't read, whose kind of cognitive abilities in terms of communication from a written perspective are not quite there, are ultimately created by the invention of the printing press and by the increasing need for literacy in society, right? So children become this separate class because they need to be taught how to function in print culture. And you see a distinct shift, right? Where education was something only for the elites, and even then a small subsection of the elites. It becomes a critical goal for people starting in this period, right? And, you can see this, right? So 120 years after the invention of the printing press, which historically is really not a very long time, you already have the Presbyterians in Scotland calling for a national system of education. And print, it impacts really, I don't think you can understate how much it impacts life in Europe, right? You go, prior to the invention of the printing press, right, Europe is entirely Catholic. In 1517, on Halloween, October 31st, 1517, right, you get the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, which splits Europe between Catholic and Protestants. And then you get competition between Catholics and Protestants as to who's going to be the most powerful and the most advanced. Education, literacy, and technology start to play a role in this as well, right? And it's like everybody is fighting to try and become the most advanced, right? So this is really a huge shift in world history. Alrighty. Okay. So, obviously, according to Postman, where literacy is high, there are schools, right? Because you need a place for this to be taught. Where there are schools, a concept of childhood starts to develop. And not, for nothing, one of the places that develops the most quickly in terms of its sense of youth and childhood is England, right? England, for lots of kind of cultural and historical reasons, is really, really kind of odd, right? And it ends up getting well ahead, of the rest of Europe in many, many ways. And one of the ways is it has some of the most developed notions of childhood and a real focus on education. And you can see the shift, right? So, 1480, right? 40 years after the invention of the printing press, right? So you're still at the beginnings of this. There were 30 schools in England, right? So we're talking not here about the entire UK, right? We'll be talking about just, the part of the UK specifically that we would call England, right? So not Scotland, not Wales. 34 schools in all of England in that period. By 1660, right? So, it's not quite 2 centuries later. There's 440 schools, about one every 12 miles. So a big increase in the number of schools. And, a consequent kind of shift in the way people are thinking about childhood. All right. No questions so far, I guess. It's so weird doing this online again. I feel like, shot back in time to COVID times, and I'm just not entirely at ease with this anymore. It's a little odd, but we'll muster through here. Okay. So, ultimately what Postman says is schools change the relationship of adults to children. And he suggests that, during the Middle Ages, when communication was primarily done orally, right? It was literally your words, right? You talked, and that's how you communicated. And so children were, able to communicate very, very quickly, right? So that by age 6, 7, they were off to the workforce. What you had in the Middle Ages, essentially, according to Postman, was this sense of children as miniature adults. And he suggests that the printing press refigures this and they become more unformed adults. Now, I do think here, Postman's thinking is a little bit more problematic than you otherwise might want it to be. One of the things that Postman cites in the book, right, is the fact that if you look at portraits of the time, what you get is, people when they're painting children, in kind of the clothing of adults, right? These are not, children put in, children's clothing. They basically look like little adults in the clothes. And he gets this from a fellow named Philip Aries, who had this same kind of thesis, and Postman's basing a lot of what he's saying on Philip Aries. And now what people have pointed out from, looking at the evidence that Aries cites is, if you're talking about portraiture, right, and painting portraits of children or family portraits, you're not exactly getting a candid shot. And this is not equivalent to, say, a photograph. Because if you are, putting your children to get a portrait made of them, you're probably dressing them up in their nicest clothes, which is going to be the thing that looks the closest to adult clothes, right? And I mean, if you look at pictures of, family photos and pictures of kids, even from, say, 20, 30 years ago, a lot of times people were, when this was still a thing, going to the Sears portrait studio for their family picture, and everybody was wearing their Sunday best, right? And so if you took that as your piece of evidence, you might conclude that, oh yes, children in this period are just miniature adults as well. But that's not his only piece of evidence, right? One of the things we know is that under the economic system of the Middle Ages, right, basically as soon as children were able to start doing the tasks, either on the family farm or in some kind of trade, they were sent to do so, right? They contributed to the economic life of their families very, very quickly, right? So that by age 6, 7, basically, you were part of the economic system in some way, shape, or form. So what you get, right, ultimately through this system is that in a lot of ways, children are just miniature adults, right? They're working, they're part of the economic system from a very young age in a way that today seems quite shocking. Okay. What happens once you get schools, according to Postman, and I think he's right here, is that children are shielded from the demands of the adult world for longer, right? And initially, and it takes a long time for this to get to the point where we're at today, right? It doesn't happen all at once. But for that time that children are in school, they're shielded from the demands of the adult world. And this over time, right, over the 4 or 5 centuries, until you get to modernity, this period gets longer and longer, right? Gradually, it goes from, people getting, basic reading and writing skills and then being pulled out of school to eventually, once we get to the middle part of the 20th century, people, the expectation being that people are going to get at least a high school education, right? So that you can see that period kind of getting longer and longer. According to Postman, right, learning becomes sequential and hierarchical, right? So basically, because reading itself, right, requires the development of literacy as a skill, right, you basically move from simple to complex, right? The basics of reading, and you build on that over time. And the basics of mathematics, and you build over time, right? So one skill needs to be learned before moving on to another, right? The other thing that happens is, and what Postman suggests is once you cluster children together, you start to realize that different kinds of children have different kinds of commonalities, right? So you start to cluster children more and more by age, right? Because ability, in a lot of cases, when it comes to literacy or numeracy and these sorts of things, ends up being tied to physical development, especially physical development of the brain, right? So you start to notice that all 6-year-olds are kind of the same in terms of their ability to learn how to read, and all 7-year-olds are kind of the same, and all 8-year-olds. And so you start to get this idea, again, it doesn't happen all at once. It takes a long time to get from where that starts to where we are today. But once that kind of gets started, you start to get this sense of like hierarchical, right? You're going to do the tasks of the first grade before you move on to the second grade, right? Now you still have things like one-room schoolhouses and these sorts of things that are features of the educational landscape for a long time. That's a function of the size of communities and the resources. But there does get to be this sense that, okay, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds need to be learning different things because they are different in some way. Alrighty. I'll just go back here. Still no questions. Do feel free.
Oh my. I don't know. Yeah. I did once. Honestly, because the issue it was fun when I went, but what did you guys do? Yeah,
Okay.
Ready? Yeah. When I looked at the hospital, this is where I looked at the
Alrighty. Ooh. Okay. jump back in here. Okay. Let's keep going and get y'all out of here as soon as possible. Okay, so obviously here's where we ended off a minute ago. And so far, as I can tell, I've failed to be boring enough to get any of you to drop the class. So, I'm kidding. I was checking something else, not at all looking at that. All right, so schools, right? Change the relationship of adults and children. Okay, so according to Postman and what he kind of thinks is going on, once we separate people into these distinct age categories, right, and abilities according to age, you start to get the emergence of specific youth cultures. Now, this is just starting right kind of in, the 1500s, the 16th century, and by the 18th century, it's more formed. Where we'll really see this take its greatest shape is in the 20th century, when we get compulsory universal public education, and we put a bunch of kids in public school. Kids way outnumber adults. So we'll start to get things like really, really distinct youth cultures, especially say amongst the baby boomers, where you get things like the hippie generation and all of that stuff. But this is just sort of the start, right? Once you start putting young people together in a confined space, you start to get youth cultures, right? And Postman kind of notes, this is a quote from the book, when any group is formed on the basis of a characteristic, in this case, age, it's inevitable that you start to notice other characteristics. So, by the end of the 15th century, or the 1500s, the 16th century, you start to get more of a norm around children having distinct children's fashions, right? And especially amongst the middle and upper classes, you get parents basically treating their kids as items of, or objects of conspicuous consumption, right? They start to buy things specifically for their children. You start to get a differentiation, children's books with different language, right? Language that's directed specifically at children. Books on pediatrics, right? Pediatrics written prior to 1600, we're not exactly sure when, but doctors start to notice, okay, children are different from adults in major ways, and we have to treat them differently. And the first book for children, right, which is this one, The History of Jack the Giant Killer. It's the first children's book that we have record of, and we still have copies of it kicking around today. It's published in 1744, right? So language differentiation, children's books, it all comes from starting to think of children as different from adults, right? So you stop learning you stop at a certain point just teaching kids to read with adult books, like say the Bible, and you start teaching them to read with children's books, right? And the first one that we have a copy of is Jack the Giant Killer. Okay. So the other thing that starts to happen, and this is probably, you get this prior to, like in the 1700s, right? So we're talking about the 18th century, but in the 1700s, you start to move towards more of a notion of what you would call the modern nuclear family, right? Where you start to move away, and this increases with industrialization, but you get mom, dad, and their kids, right? As the nuclear family, right? So part of this, and again, this doesn't happen equally. You get this first emerging in the middle and upper class. I don't know what I did. You get this first emerging in the middle and upper classes, and then it's going to trickle down to the working class and the poor much later on. Excuse me. So ultimately, what this results from the long period of schooling, right? We need long periods of schooling, so it reshapes the kind of form of the family, right? We start to get, certain ideological kind of shifts, particularly like the one I was mentioning with Luther's Catechism, the idea that parents are the key educators of their children, and that mother and father have these particular kind of teaching roles for their kids. So parents become the key educators, and in places that are wealthy. So we're thinking here principally of England, because England gets there first. but we can say to some extent in the Netherlands and in Denmark as well, you start to get the middle class, separating away from extended family groups and using their increased wealth to buy larger segmented homes, right? So you go from that single room kind of house towards, more what we would think of as a house today, right? With a kitchen and a dining area and more kind of, children's bedrooms. And if you think of, sorry, I'll give you a weird example of this, but I think it works. If you think of the movie Peter Pan, right? Think of the classic Disney animated one, right? Despite all of its weird racial things. One of the things that's really interesting about it and about this particular story is that it starts in, the nursery. Right? So this middle class English home somewhere in the 19th century has a nursery, right? So a place where the children all sleep together in a single room. And what's the big conflict in the story? Well, it's that Wendy, she's transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and she's going to have to leave the nursery, and she'll have to be separated from her brothers because she's moving into adulthood, right? And there's a sort of cultural, I don't want to say cultural trauma, but definitely a cultural moment associated with the film Peter Pan, right? So you go from the one-room house to a house with at least a parent's room and a nursery and some other kinds of spaces. Other things you might kind of start to see, is things like smoking rooms. Can't write. For some reason, I can never write on the bottom of the screen. Smoking rooms or studies or these kinds of things, especially amongst the wealthy and middle class, right? And if you've ever watched the show Downton Abbey, right, you know that after dinner, the men go off to the smoking room to drink whiskey and smoke cigars and talk about politics, all those things that aren't appropriate for the children or the women, right? So you start to get these distinctions between public knowledge and private space, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide as well. Yeah, children, become objects of conspicuous consumption for the middle class and upper classes that can afford it. You buy special toys, special books, special clothing for your children, and you start to consume products, right? Buy products from the burgeoning industrial economy for your children, which, it starts to produce these things as well. Now, that said, it's going to take a long time for this to trickle down to the lower classes. And so you get things like, if we want to talk other literary references, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, right? Which takes place in the 19th century, right? The 1800s. And you see, a lot of working class kids forced still into labor, right? There are chimney sweeps and there are kids working in factories and mines and all of these kind of horrors of the early industrial period. They don't get, their own rooms or special clothing or conspicuous consumption from their parents because they come from different classes altogether. Okay. So what's most important for Postman, though, is that, adults, once you get into teaching, once you get kids into school, and this will become more important as we go forward, right, through the 19th century and industrialization into the 20th century with compulsory schooling up to the age of 16, you basically have adults controlling the symbolic environment of young people more and more, right? And the transition from childhood to adulthood is one that's measured out, again, not equally socially, starts in the middle classes, but you start to kind of slowly roll out knowledge, information to young people as you think they're ready for it. So the transition from childhood to adulthood becomes one that's deeply controlled by the adults, right? Children evolve, and I use that word consciously, towards adulthood by becoming readers, right? By consuming a particular type of media. And what does that build? So according to Postman, and this is a very, this comes from a very particular school of media studies. You might he calls it media ecology, but if you think of what's his name? The Toronto guy, Marshall McLuhan, right? Has this aphorism, the medium is the message. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. But that print sort of changes the way people think, right? So it does a couple of things. According to Postman, it builds individuality. Why? Well, because you consume print individually, right? You and the book are kind of in a one-to-one relationship, right? You learn to read, and it kind of cuts you off from the rest of the world. Again, if you're a Disney fan, think of Beauty and the Beast, right? And the beginning of Beauty and the Beast, Belle is walking around with her head in a book, right? With her face in a book, and she's barely aware of what's going on around her, right? So she's in that individual relationship with the written word, right? So it builds individuality, and that experience you have within the book is just yours. It's not a communal one. Logical and sequential thinking, right? Grammar and learning the rules of grammar sort of require a sort of logical and sequential thinking. High order abstraction, right? Suddenly books can take you away from the here and now, right? I hate to use Harry Potter as an example, but you know, even though none of those things exist, you can be transported away by a Harry Potter novel to Hogwarts, you know, a world where there's wizards and witches and, you know, Voldemorts and Snapes and all of these sorts of things, and Dumbledore. All of these things, right? This is an abstraction, right? You can imagine things that aren't actually there. You can imagine a machine, right, designed by someone else if you see the schematics of it and explained to you in print. So it creates a level of abstraction that's ordered outside of your everyday experience. And for Postman, I don't know how true this is, but he certainly thinks so, print requires delayed gratification, right? Because you have to sit there and you have to sort of experience the thing. You have to put your, you know, your life on hold to read the book. You know, if you're going to read a mystery novel or you're going to read Harry Potter and you're going to get to the ending where Harry kills Voldemort, you know, you have to take the time. So you have to delay your gratification as you work through the text, right? And so, very importantly though, learning becomes an intellectual and a moral pursuit. Teaching young people how to read becomes something that's coached in terms of morality, and the cardinal sin starts to become, and this is especially true in the Enlightenment, one of the worst things that you can be is ignorant, right? Because ignorance is the opposite of having learned, and you learn through reading. Okay. Oh yeah, I just made that. It's extremely hot. That was poor planning on my part. All right, I should have taken the one I've been cooling for hours. Oh, one day I'll learn. My tumbler is too good. I'm going to open the lid so it can be cool. All right. So, I have way too much liquid here. This is going to be bad. All right. You know the class will be over when I really, really have to go pee. Okay, so, kind of like what I was saying a slide or two ago, you get a distinction with print and with, you know, growing wealth, these segmented houses between public and private spheres, right? And particularly, you know, it's gendered to begin with, you know, in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries, they have strongly gendered kind of spheres, but you start to get a distinction between what you do in public and what's public knowledge and what happens in the privacy of the home. So you start to build a notion of individual privacy, individual freedoms, and individual distinction in that way. So you get things like public knowledge, things that are okay to be discussed anywhere. And especially, right, this is often phrased in terms of what can you talk about in front of women and children, right? Because these are seen as somehow more delicate than men. So public knowledge is what's okay to talk about in the everyday. And famously, it excludes things like sex, war, politics, religion, economics in lots of cases. So, and then private knowledge, what needs to be kept secret from some, right? So why do the men in Downton Abbey go off to the smoking room to talk about the politics of the day? Well, they go to the smoking room because that knowledge is supposed to be kept secret from the children and the women, right? It is supposed to be, it's somehow not appropriate for them. It is a sort of private knowledge. So, only when you're deemed adult enough are you let in on certain things, right? So you're not as opposed to the Middle Ages where there was no real need to teach people about sex because everybody just sort of knew, it becomes something that there has to be a process for learning about sex, right? The awkward sex ed class you had in elementary and junior high fundamentally comes from the fact that, at least in theory, we keep that knowledge from people until we think they're ready for it. And Postman thinks, you know, it's in this period that shame really returns in European society as an important category. When you start to get private ideas, public ideas, private space, right? Certain things go on in the bedroom that the children aren't supposed to know about. And all of this is kind of, under the supervision of teachers and parents. Now, as time goes on, much more of it shifts into the realm of teachers, right? Where, things like today we think of sex ed as something principally that teachers are going to end up doing rather than parents, but that is not neither here nor there at this point. Okay, so industrialization, right? So prior to industrialization, we start really industrialization in England in major ways, roughly the middle part of the 18th century, about 1750. And this is where you get that really, really strong split between the classes, right? Because the wealth of this class, shoots up. The merchant class in England, had already been doing well prior to the Industrial Revolution, and some of this had been happening, but it just goes completely, I don't want to say bonkers, but the disparity between the kind of upper and middle classes and the working class and the poor, I don't want to say these guys go down, but they just kind of stay where they always were, right? So you get a real distinction. So you get a huge blossoming of childhood for the young of the upper and middle classes. And, the children of the poor and working class, continue to get, continue to work. They're still in factories. They're chimney sweeps. They're all of these things that you see, in Charles Dickens's novels from the 18th century. And it's all, a kind of strange thing happens. I don't want to get ahead of myself because I can't remember what's on this slide. Okay, I'll jump. I'll say this. Sorry, I forgot what was on my slides because I've taught this so many times now I don't remember. Okay, so what ends up happening, right, is eventually what happens is these folks, the upper and middle classes, they have their kids, right, and they think of their children as these lovely creatures. They're so innocent, and you start to get this narrative. The childhood is a time of innocence and a time of joy and a time of play. And it takes a while, right? It'll take until, the middle part of the 19th century and then into the kind of end of the 19th century and 20th century. But people start to think of the children, people here, right, in the upper and middle classes, look at the people here and they see children, right? They have their own children. They start to see the children of the working class and the poor as children themselves. And so they start to think, we need to start treating these children the same way we treat ours. Now, this will end up taking on some really weird classist and even at times racist sort of orientations because, in the 19th century, you get what's called, in the upper and middle classes, and you can see this in England, you see this in America, and you see this in Canada, what ends up being called the child saving movement. So it's a sort of reaction to, seeing the children of the working and lower classes and the, poor suffering, right? They often don't have enough to eat. They're having to work. Their parents have orphaned them, right, or abandoned them, or they've been orphaned. So they have no kind of means to support themselves. They start committing crimes. They get into all sorts of trouble. And so the upper and middle classes sort of think, okay, we have to save these children. And often, it's blamed on their parents being of inferior kind of moral stock. There's a lot of discourses around Irish and Italians, being poor parents. Why? Because they're Catholic. And, all the people here tend to be Anglicans or Protestants of some kind. But you start to get this notion that young people need to be cared for in some way, right? And that it's the responsibility of the society to take care of them and somehow get the children that are down here up here. And this is where you get, in the 19th century, child labor laws starting, right? They're like, we can't have young people working in factories, so we have to pass laws banning child labor. The kind of beginnings of the social welfare system. And this will become really important when we get to the unit on crime, because the whole kind of youth criminal justice system emerges, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century from this kind of movement. But It's them noticing that these children of the poor and working class are just like their children, except they don't have all of the advantages. Okay, excuse me. So, Postman brings up a couple of interesting ideas that emerge sort of at different times, but ultimately have come to sort of govern how we think about children. So this one, you've probably heard this phrase before, right? The blank slate, right? So that when kids are born, they're a blank slate. The Latin phrase is tabula rasa, right? Which literally just means blank slate. This is the idea that comes, and this is from John Locke. And Locke sort of looks at children as like, okay, when children come into the world, they're sort of unformed, right? They're like a piece of paper that no one's written on, or a chalkboard that no one has written anything on. They are completely blank. So, what goes wrong? How do you end up? How do you end up with bad kids? Well, you have bad parents and teachers that write bad things on that blank slate. So, what do you need to do? Like, what's the moral imperative in this kind of system? Well, because the mind is blank, right, you have to write good things on it. And so this ultimately kind of leads into a shift into expert classes in some ways, right? You need experts that are trained in writing good things on these blank slates. So the professionalization of, say, the teacher kind of comes from this idea, right? We need to write good things on the blank slate of young people's minds, and we need people trained to do that. So we train teachers, we create teachers' colleges specifically for that. And generally, again, something went dark and I panicked. Generally this is the sort of elite class imposing their values on everybody else. So, Locke also has this idea that children don't just need to be trained mentally, but also physically. So for those of you who are traumatized by junior high and high school gym class, you can thank John Locke for that, because fundamentally it's kind of his idea. It's like, oh, we need to make sure that kids are physically trained as well as mentally trained, so we'll have them do gym class. And you can also probably thank John Locke for grades. Because it's not just about, learning something, but we need to evaluate what people know, and we need to shame those who are doing bad and credit those who are doing good. So we create things like grades and ways of marking things. And, if you were the one traumatized because you didn't get the star sticker that said good job in first grade, ultimately you can blame John Locke for that as well. So if you're still holding that against that kid that always got the star, John Locke is actually the one to blame. Now, I mean, this kind of idea plays out in really weird ways, right? It has a long history, but one of the other places that you can kind of find it is in residential schools. So, when the Canadian government, as part of the Indian Act of 1876, is thinking of, how are they going to integrate Indigenous people into Canadian society? Obviously they have a notion, formed in the culture of their time, that European culture and Christian culture is superior to Indigenous cultures. And so they're like, all right, what we have to do, and sort of impetus behind residential schools, is we need to be the ones to get to the blank slate first, right? So we're going to write good, English. I was going to draw a Union Jack, but probably take too long. Good English and Christian things on that blank slate before their Indigenous parents have a chance to write all of those, Indigenous things on the blank slate. So all of this, it has these kinds of good and bad sides. It creates fundamentally the Western way of thinking about young people in some ways, but also it's like, okay, well, if we get there first and we put them in schools that we control, teaching them things that we control, we can, essentially wipe out Indigenous cultures. So it kind of comes from that place too. Okay. Rousseau. Rousseau. All right. So one of the other kind of ideas that Postman flags as being really central to young people, and how we think about young people come from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And there could scarcely be a more ironic person to base your ideas of childhood on than Rousseau, because while he had very distinct... Is that my microphone buzzing? I'm just going to mute that for a sec. I don't know what's buzzing.
It happened.
Weird. All right. It was the main program audio. Okay. Oh, that's so annoying, that low-level buzzing. All right, much better. Okay. Yeah, Rousseau, a really weird kind of character in the history of Western thought. Notable for the fact that he wrote a lot about children, but, fathered numerous children and abandoned all of them. So, his account of childhood as this wonderful time that we need to protect is strangely at odds with, the fact that he treated them terribly. I mean, this is like roughly akin to noting that Marx, a proponent of the working class, seemed to hate them with a special kind of hatred, and often mistreated, say, his maid in particular ways, and may have sexually assaulted a number of his housekeepers. So, for the guy who was like, proletariat of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. By the way, I'm the one chaining you. Marx was a special character. Rousseau, kind of like Marx, had some interesting ideas. We never managed to quite live up to them. Okay, some of the ideas from Rousseau, that children are a good in and of themselves, right? So they're not the means to some sort of end, right? That children weren't, in the Lockean sense, something that we shape for the good of society. No, that children are good in and of themselves, and they should be treated as such. And one of the things that, and I think we still see this in discourses today, and especially, how much we hold up youth and youthful energy and youth protest as being somehow, okay, I'll put it this way, because I don't know how else to put it. This is an idea, right? That, children, their emotional psychological needs approach the state of nature, right? That they are the closest to what humans actually are, and there's something special and unique that has to be upheld about that, right? They have this energy, this dynamism, this strength, this joy, and sometimes, shall we say, a sort of special wisdom that only the young have. And where do we see this in kind of contemporary society? Because this idea is still definitely around. How dare I? Right? So Greta, how dare you use me as an example? You've stolen my childhood. All right. I've stolen her childhood to use as an example, right? So Greta Thunberg, right, the environmental activist, I think she's now like almost 20, so barely counts. But when she was like 16, right, she had her protests, and she was held up by, world leaders as this, young person whose voice we really, really should listen to. Why? Because she had that strength, that dynamism, that passion of youth, right? And a sort of special wisdom, right? Because she was closer to that sort of state of nature because she's still a child, right? Now she's gotten older, people pay less attention to her because she's not as useful in that way. Okay, now interestingly, and I think really important, instead of writing on the blank slate, one of the things that Rousseau really stresses is that children need to be lovingly cultivated, and that education is there to make whatever they're already good at grow, right? So education becomes less about shaping them towards an end that society needs. Like, do we need good workers? Well, no. What we should be doing is shaping people so that their inclinations ultimately, and the things that they're good at, the things that they're interested in, emerge, right? So if they're a great artist, we should, or they're good at drawing, we should shape that so they become a great artist. In my case, the reason I spend $1,000 or more a year on horseback riding lessons is because I'm lovingly cultivating my daughter's love of horses. I wish she loved something cheaper. Sorry. Oh, horses. I haven't yet purchased a horse, but my daughter is pushing me. She's like, well, that girl got a horse for her birthday. I'm like, yeah, that girl's parents are millionaires. So I'm just a poor, corrupt professor. All right. Oh, Freud. Is this because you heard my rant about Freud and sociology of religion? Okay. I hate Freud passionately. Hess Sigmund. All right. So Freud, I won't go on quite the rant. If you want to hear my rant about how stupid I think Freud is, you have to take sociology of religion with me, wherein I lament the fact that his account of how religion emerges is pure fiction. But like most of what Freud says, Freud, I think, still has a bunch of things that he contributes to ideas of childhood, rather sadly. Okay, so Freud, amongst others, talks about the fact that children have an emergent sexuality, right? And we'll never, I think, quite get away from Freud. And that there's this kind of duality in human beings, right? There's these instincts and drives, and that the whole goal and the whole way that we emerge as adults is ultimately to crush those drives, to form them, to sublimate them. And once you've sublimated them, you can truly be called an adult. Now, the other thing, obviously, that Freud talks about is that this leaves a whole bunch of trauma on people, right? That basically the sublimation of our desires and our kind of natural instincts leaves us often wanting to go back to those things. And that, the process of creating adults in a kind of industrial society or in a civilized society is about kind of crushing the natural part of human beings and forcing them into this industrial mold, right? Not for nothing, the book that this comes out as is called Civilization and Its Discontents, right? That basically, the adult is sort of the crushed child and the de-instinctivized child. Now, I think, again, Freud comes with all sorts of problems, and has all sorts of fictions, like the idea that all boys want to murder their fathers and sleep with their mothers, which is the Oedipus complex, and all girls want to kill their mothers and sleep with their fathers, the Electra complex, which he takes from classical antiquity. And, I don't know. I feel like Jordan Peterson could make the same case, but we won't go into it. All right. And now we'll talk about the last one, because I actually think Dewey, in lots of ways, is probably the most interesting. And along with Locke, I think one of the ones whose influence remains in major ways. Dewey, you talk about him a lot. If you take an education degree, you talk about Dewey's ideas a lot. But again, like Rousseau, he sort of stresses that, children have to be treated as a good in and of themselves, not the means to an end, right? So away from that Lockean idea that the goal of children is to become adults, right? So we shape them into adults. That actually they just their needs need to be addressed in the present, right? The children are a special kind of category, and you need to figure out what they need at a particular moment, rather than thinking, how do I get, I don't know, let's say little Timmy. How do we get from here to Big Timmy, right? Dewey is like, okay, but what does little Timmy need? And this is, I think, kind of still the basis of kind of contemporary educational theory. It's like, what are the needs of these particular people at their specific ages, and how do we, address those needs so that when we get to, Big Timmy, he's smiling. Sorry, my drawing is terrible. I love doodling on my slides, but I'm probably bad at it, right? So we want, people to be well adjusted, happy individuals when they get to adulthood. Okay. All right, so a couple more slides here, and then we'll just start talking about generations a little bit. But I do want to end off, just talking about what kind of happens at the end of the 19th century and in the 19th century. So Postman, I think, does a good job of covering, basically what happens from about 1440 till, 1800 or the middle part of the 19th century, 1850. And it's this slow kind of evolution and discovery that children are a thing, right? And it goes from, it takes 400 years, 4 centuries to really go to something that roughly kind of has a modern idea of childhood. By the time we get to the early 20th century, the idea of childhood is relatively recognizable. And it's basically, right, this idea that children are innocent, right? There's an innocence. And that this is a time that needs to be protected by adults, right? It's a time where they're, and I guess childhood is a time of emergence. I can spell, I swear. Emergence, right? It's a time of innocence and emergence where we're cultivating, developing, and sort of shaping young people into the adults that they'll ultimately be, right? And the big shift from the Middle Ages where it was just, you're 14, or sorry, you're 4 or you're 6, and it's like, okay, go pick some eggs, go milk the cow, go learn how to cobble a cobbled thing. I know, it's a boot. But it's funny to say cobble a cobbled thing, right? Or blacksmith a blacksmith thing, where you're in the economy right away. And increasingly, by the time we hit the 19th century, the idea is we actually need to keep young people out of the economy. We need to allow them to form and develop more naturally and towards a kind of slow emergence into adulthood, right? And again, we start to get more and more, as we, learn more about children, as they're separated, as more of them go to school, as, they're shaped, we start to see differences. And one of the big ones is the discovery of adolescence, right? So, again, this is kind of weird to think about, right? Because we don't have a term really for adolescence in English until somewhere around, the later part of the 19th century. So we're talking not even 200 years ago, right? But we discover adolescence as a distinct phase of kind of human development somewhere towards the end of the 19th century. And again, it's because we just start to think about it differently, right? It's not that people didn't go through puberty before, they did, but it wasn't, and there were, rituals that happened somewhere around like 12, 13, where suddenly you kind of became a man. But in terms of, my daughter's 14. Keep calm and survive puberty. I resonate with this. Okay. So, she's very grumpy yesterday because she didn't get to sleep for 12 hours. Like, I need sleep, Dad. I'm like, okay, sure, but I also need you to do your homework before 3 a.m. So, victory for one of us. All right. So what happens, right? So we discover adolescence, right? And, pediatricians, doctors start talking, okay, there's this distinct phase we're going to call adolescence that happens, somewhere between like 12 and ends somewhere around 16, 17, depending on the sex of the person. So, we sort of discover it and start talking about it towards the end of the 19th century. And then, what happens is we start to try and control it, right? So towards the end of the 19th century, and again, especially in England, because England's weird, middle-class boys, start to be subject to strict disciplines, especially around sexuality, right? In the Victorian era, so end of the 19th century when Queen Victoria is the queen, there's this huge focus on sex. And so, you do a bunch of really weird things. Middle-class boys, for instance, are sent off to boarding schools. And especially in remote places in England. And one of the reasons for this, is we need to keep them away from girls, right? As they're going through puberty, so that we don't somehow misshape their view of the opposite sex. And we can tame their sort of predatory sexual instincts. So, excuse me, sorry, I'm really coughing a lot. I apologize. They're subject to strict discipline, especially around sexuality, sent off to boarding schools, and managing sex, especially during this period of puberty, becomes a major social concern. And one that we still live with, right? One that, we're still deeply concerned about in ways that, again, the medievals would have found genuinely incomprehensible. Okay, and what happens, the 19th century, as I was saying, you get the child-saving movement in response to a bunch of social changes. So as you get into industrialization, it creates a whole underclass of people who are really poor. And what's typically happening is a couple of things. Either, children are being abandoned by their parents who can't support them because they've moved into these industrial cities. There's no birth control, so they're having children. They can't support them, so they abandon them, and these kids are left to kind of fend for themselves. You get the massive growth of orphanages and these sorts of institutions to try and deal with this massive social problem. Or parents are, just busy, Mom and dad are both working. Dad is probably working off in a factory, and mom is at home, both taking care of younger children and probably working as well, right? So they have this weird system that's called the putting out system, where basically, the shirts, all the cloth is cut in the factory and then sent to some poor woman's apartment where, between making meals, breastfeeding, having children, taking care of children, she also sews some, a blouse or a shirt or something, and then sends it back to the factory and gets paid for each shirt that she completes. So everybody's working. We won't get the idea of the stay-at-home mom until really the 1930s, when worker wages rise to the point where only one parent can work, and that's enough to sustain the family. And then kids at a certain age are just cut loose, right? It's like, go play in the street with your friends. And you can imagine kind of how well that works. Kids start to get in trouble, they commit crimes, they steal things. Young people start to have sex, girls turn to prostitution to help out their families and support them. And the whole thing goes kind of awry. So that by the time you reach the kind of middle part of the 19th century, it becomes a major social problem. And the society sort of starts to band around, what are we going to do with young people? And what comes out of this is the beginnings of a social welfare system, right? You get, child protective services, and its precursors sort of emerge here. Public schooling as a solution, right? Well, what do we do with all these kids that are in the streets because their parents are working or orphaned? Well, we put them in public schools where they will at least learn, the basic skills to be an industrial worker later. And then the youth criminal justice system. When kids have gone too far off the reservation, when kids have gone too far off into kind of criminality, what do we do with them? Well, we're going to put them into a justice system that's aim is to rehabilitate them. We'll talk about this when we get to crime, but what this looks like is things like industrial schools and a probation system that allows judges to put people in school for a long time. Okay. Is that my... Okay. It's my last slide there. All right. So. Ow, that hurt. All right. So I will jump in to one other thing here. We'll do this for a couple minutes, and then I can't let you go a half hour early. Or could I? No, I refuse. We'll start talking about generations a little bit, and then we'll pick it up next time. And right, I have to restore my screen because it hates me. And my battery's about to die. How long do I have? Tell me. 23%. That's plenty. Okay, sorry. You're like, please die. No. All right. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit into the middle part of the 20th century. And we're going to look specifically at an account of kind of the different generations coming from Jean Twenge. So we're gonna skip ahead to basically look at kind of the youth experiences of a bunch of different generations, starting with the silence. Okay, so this book. So most of the information here is going to be taken from this book, which is Generations by Jean Twenge. So Jean is a psychologist. I guess she's a social psychologist. She's based at San Diego State University. From her early career, she's been a generational researcher, started working on questions about Gen X, and then wrote a couple of very unflattering books about millennials called The Narcissism Epidemic. Ouch, yeah, it hurts. About millennials and how we're all narcissists, followed by Generation Me, which is, basically accusing millennials of being just ever so self-focused. And then her most recent one before this was called iGen, where she wrote about sort of the internet's effect on Gen Z, who she wanted to call iGen, but it didn't really take. Okay, so Jean has a really interesting theory, and it's a really good book. Came out in March of 2023, so it's pretty current. And she argues for what she calls the technology model of generations, right? And really kind of starting with, okay, so what's clear is that, prior to the silent generation, technological changes happened rather slowly, right? And we think of what we just talked about, with the printing press, how it affected kind of our idea of childhood and youth. It took a really long time. Once we get into the 20th century, however, technological change starts to move a lot more quickly, right? And especially after the Second World War, we get just a rapid kind of pace of kind of generational change. And so what she argues is that basically each generation is more or less defined by the technological conditions they experienced in their formative years, kind of between 12 and the end of their 20s, right? And that technological kind of environment shapes them through their whole lives. And it affects a whole bunch of things, right? Family, education, work, leisure, religion, politics, and mental health in significant ways. So the technological environment, you might call her a bit of a technological determinist, is going to shape the whole experience of young people. And she will suggest that new technologies create what she calls, or what we call, generation gaps and conflicts, where, young people will feel that their parents simply don't understand them because they're experiencing this whole new technological kind of world, right? That their parents are going to struggle to understand because they were shaped in a different technological era. So, the fact that my wife has a really, really hard time understanding what my son is doing when he's playing Fortnite with his friends, right? And they're chatting and talking and they're, cutting each other down and saying how terrible each other. I play Fortnite with my son and his friends and they think it's hilarious. Because they're like, dude, your dad plays Fortnite? I'm like, yeah, I suck at it, but I do play. Although I made it to Diamond before he did. So I'm going to hold that. But I did it with a very particular strategy of hiding really, really well. I discovered Bush Camp Dad on YouTube and I'm like, I like this. Hiding. That's how I'm going to play from now on. So anyway. I'm really good at this game, by which I mean I'm good at hiding in bushes and other buildings. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, the fact my wife is just absolutely bamboozled by what these technologies are, and that my son and his friends, get home from school and immediately jump on Fortnite and spend time with each other. She literally just doesn't understand. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I kind of get it, but whatever. I'm trying to avoid the generation gap. At some point, I'm going to fall behind. All right. So the other thing that she'll suggest is that because of the accelerating pace of technological change, our generational cohorts are getting shorter and shorter. And you'll kind of see the dates as we go along. The periods get relatively short. The period for millennials and then for Gen Z, these periods are going to get shorter and shorter as we hit more and more technological change. Okay, so basically the other thing that she relies upon is what she calls life history theory. And basically she suggests that, historically parents have two kinds of choices in terms of, how many children they have and how they raise those children and how many resources they put into kids. And these are called the fast life strategy and the slow life strategy. Now what she thinks is that as time has gone on, and as we've moved through from industrialization to the present, we move more and more towards this, right? What's called, I can't write anymore. I don't know what happened. My pen died. All right. It probably needs to be charged. All right. What will I do? Oh, sad. We move more towards the slow life strategy, right? Basically, okay, so what is a fast life strategy? I'll take my broken one and see if it works. Or my computer is just, it's probably because the battery's low. It's decided it hates touchscreen now. Okay, so parents essentially have two choices, right? Either you can have a lot of kids, right? And you basically expect them to grow up very quickly so that they are able to take care of themselves in relatively short order, right? So probably by late childhood, early adolescence, they're able to, fend for themselves more or less. Okay, Fast life strategy, really common in societies where there's a high risk of mortality for both adults and children. So if you kind of expect that your life expectancy is going to be somewhere in the 30s or 40s, chances are you're going to do a couple of things. You're going to start having children early, and you're going to kind of raise those kids to be as self-sufficient as possible, as quickly as possible. And you just have as many kids as you can, and just hope some of them make it, right? And that's basically the fast life strategy in a nutshell. Okay, the slow life strategy, so in these societies, right, more children earlier, more likely to be self-sufficient when one or both parents die. Infant mortality, in 1800 was 1 in 6. So 1 in 6 babies born died before their first birthday. And you can see the change by 2020, it's less than 1 in 200. So a giant change. So most of history, the fast life strategy is the way people went, right? Because, women especially died, so mothers died in childbirth at astonishing rates. Children died of, disease in infancy and early childhood at fairly shocking rates as well. So you had more children basically to hope that some of them would survive and make it, right? Okay, as we move forward in time, as life gets a little bit more complicated, and specifically as mortality drops, we end up in what's called a slow life strategy. So less adult and infant mortality, and typically a slow life strategy is also marked by more complex economic circumstances. So education takes longer. So parents have fewer children and nurture them more. Why? Because in order to get them to the point of adulthood where they're self-sufficient, it's actually going to require a ton of resources. So think about today, right? And all of you are in university. I'm sure some of you have parents that are helping you out pay for university. This is why we have, in some senses, a slow life strategy now, because your parents are having to invest, in you for probably 20 odd years or more, right? Oh, my daughter told me she's not moving out till she's 25, and I'm like, great, super. I'll be paying for horseback riding lessons till I die. It'll be awesome. No, I love my daughter. I'm teasing a little bit. All right, so a bigger risk than, say, dying in childhood is actually falling behind economically, right? And not having, the resources or the access to become economically successful and, fully independent. So think about, the discourses that are going on now, right? Where we're talking about Gen Z, especially in Canada, because we're run by the right and honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and we'll soon be run by someone else who will be equally as incompetent. I told you I hate everyone. But we're in a situation now where we're talking about Gen Z will never be able to own a home, right? And that economically trying to get ahead, right, get that education, get that job in that field that's going to allow you access to that middle class, prosperous life is becoming more and more difficult. So your parents are having to invest more and more time and energy into, cultivating you, right? I don't know, putting you into programming classes when you're, or what coding when you're in elementary school, sending you to coding camp or science camp and all of these things, hoping that some are, making you take music lessons. God, my music lessons were a waste of time when I was a kid. 6 years of piano lessons, and I was terrible. Oh, my parents wasted their cultivation. They should have cultivated something else. But, we cultivate our kids extensively, hoping, that they don't fall behind economically, right? That they're able to succeed and thrive. But it requires a lot of parental input. And this is, less so kind of risk of mortality. It's when we see a competition for seemingly scarce resources, right? So this leads to much fewer children, much more better grammar. Many fewer children, right? So people will have fewer children and put more parental resources in hopes that those children will succeed. And that very much seems to be where we are today, right? A slow life strategy. It's not just us, it's been building since, the middle part of the 20th century. All right, we'll do a couple more. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the silence, and then we'll cut out a few minutes early here. All right. Or do you want to do this? Start with the silence next time? I can go either way. Nodding, nodding. All right, let's stop. We'll pick up with the silence on Wednesday. We'll leave it here. I will let you go 12 minutes early. We'll call it our second break. So go get a coffee and don't come back. And we'll see you on Wednesday. And we'll pick it up and we'll talk about all these generations. Because this seems like a good place to stop. All righty.